Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today I've decided to do a discussion on how Russia contains NATO. Now this is likely to be a bit of a controversial topic, but I think if we want to understand both the current war in Ukraine, what's wrong with the idea that NATO expansion is behind it, and the larger global outlook for general geopolitics, this is an important topic to understand. So here we go. Basic history is that NATO and the Warsaw Pact were, during the Cold War, sort of opposing military alliances, which were there to make sure that neither side could really invade the other. The United States went through great lengths during the Cold War to contain the Soviet Union, with varying degrees of success. The most important successful aspect of the Cold War was eventually when the Russia-China split happened, that the United States was able to leverage that to weaken Russia in significant ways. This was a major part of Nixon's legacy, positive side from American history perspectives. After the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact disbanded, but NATO did not. And there was an assurance given, according to most sources, that that NATO wouldn't expand, and Russia was eventually okay with all of that. Those assurances were flat-out lies, and the American view is, hey, we didn't put anything on paper, no treaties have been ratified, therefore our word is just doesn't count. Okay. So as a result, what's happened is that the United States has tried to use expanded NATO to contain what they see as the possibility of a resurgent Russia, and this started during the Boris Yeltsin years. Now, Russia sees an expanding NATO as basically having several important national security risks associated with it. The first one is that you have the possibility of possibly rapid response weapons deployed closer and closer to Russia's borders. And this makes Russia more and more vulnerable to an outright attack. This makes Russia's nuclear deterrence more important, and the importance of mutually assured destruction as basically the important method of sort of preventing NATO from invading Russian territories and Russian allies. And so mutually assured destruction is part of Russian strategy here, but it's not the whole thing, as we'll see. NATO, on the other hand, has continued to expand and attempted to be used by the United States to contain Russia. And one of the key concerns that Russia's had is that many of the members that the United States has tried to bring into NATO are viciously anti-Russian. This is true with Poland, it's been true with Ukraine, and consequently you have not merely the possibility of more weapons deployed near Russia, but you also have the possibility that certain NATO members might help push things into a NATO-Russia war, and that this itself is an additional set of threats. So you have both of those threats. And they occur in various degrees to different states. Finland has generally enjoyed reasonably good relations with Russia, so the second danger isn't as prevalent there as it is with, say, Poland or Ukraine. But the first one is there all the time. Additionally, there's a perception, I think, and somewhat unjustified one, but I'll get to why it's unjustified in a bit, that NATO is also about westernization of governments. I think that if you look at Turkey today, I think it's very hard to make that case. The idea for a long time was that NATO should be sort of aimed for the military integration of the European Union, largely as a US ally. And then so the European Union would be the great liberalizing force and NATO would be the sort of military side of that. That hasn't worked out for reasons that I think have a lot to do with Russian containment efforts. So Russia, so the first thing to understand about NATO is that expanding NATO requires consensus. This means that treaties have to be negotiated and agreed upon by all NATO members for a new NATO member to be brought in, and the same treaties then have to be ratified by all members before the new member is actually brought in. So if we look at Sweden and Finland, and I'm going to talk about this in detail because this is to a very large extent a trial of how successful some of Russia's efforts of containing NATO actually are. And I believe that if we continue to watch them, we'll see that they're actually quite successful. So, Russia's employed, if you actually look at the last 20 years or so, a multi-pronged approach to preventing the expansion of NATO. The first method is simply cultivating a good relationship with as many NATO allies as possible, because since consensus is required to bring in a new member, any member who says, maybe this isn't a good idea, gets to stop that process. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with Finland and Sweden right now. All the heads of state have come together, negotiated treaties, and etc. And now they've gone back and looked at getting them ratified, and pretty much everybody's ratified them. The only problem is two countries haven't, and those are Hungary and Turkey. And those are the two countries which have pretty good relationships with Russia within NATO. And in particular, Turkey, I don't see ratifying this anytime in the near future. They rely on Russia not only for a lot of their energy and a lot of their tourism and a lot of their trade, but also there's this massive Russian-Turkey security cooperation in Syria, where Turkish, Russian and Syrian objectives are well aligned and quite opposed to American objectives. So here, Turkey is dependent on Russian cooperation for their own national security, much more than they're dependent on NATO cooperation. Turkey can cooperate with NATO when they want to, but their primary interests are actually Russia-facing. So why would Turkey ratify an agreement if it were to make Russia unhappy? So that's element number one, and I don't think that's really to be underestimated. In fact, if, as I expect, Finland and Sweden just simply never get ratified by Turkey and probably Hungary, then that's a victory of Russian diplomacy, right? And it means that NATO expansion is forever dead. At least as long as Turkey and Russia maintain good military and political and economic relations, and the same thing goes with economic and political relations in Hungary. So, sure, I'm sure that the U.S. will try to change those things, but there's not so much they can do. I mean, on one hand, the United States is already sanctioning Turkey for buying S-400s. That largely vindicates what Kissinger said about being an enemy of the United States being dangerous, but being an ally being likely fatal. we don't treat our friends very well. Turkey is obviously quite aware of that, and consequently, we're actually doing quite a lot to help make sure that Turkey stays very friendly to Russia. So that's step number one, cultivating good relations with NATO members. And in fact, this is sort of the interesting paradox, is that if Finland joins NATO, there's a very, very good chance that given the historically good relations between Finland and Russia, going back to Finland originally joining Russia voluntarily, there's a very good chance that Finland joining NATO would actually increase Russia's leverage over NATO in terms of future expansions. So this is more of a test of form than it's a serious threat to Russia. I think that this is something which is very different from, say, Poland coming in, because if you look at like where the calls are to kick all Russian passport holders out of Europe, they're mostly coming from Poland, right? Poland is viciously Russophobic, to the point where it's hard to tell, to what degree there's even sanity left in any discussion in that regard. So, so that one side's been very, very successful. The second area, which is more extreme, but is also more clearly successful, is that in the event where Russia sees a country moving towards joining NATO and they want to stop it, then having a territorial dispute completely prevents that country from joining NATO, because NATO will not bring in a new member if bringing in a new member extends Article 5 to territory that's under effective Russian control. So this is something which we saw in Georgia in 2008, and this was right after the Bucharest memorandum, was it Bucharest? Yeah, Bucharest memorandum, that basically said that NATO agreed that Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. And so I think with Dmitry Medvedev, his response was to enter the Georgian war and, very importantly, continue a sort of occupation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. As long as that occupation is in place, Georgia is forced to choose between moving towards joining NATO and doing that by just simply giving those territories to Russia or declaring their independence, so whatever, get rid of them out of Russian territory because we can't let Article 5 apply, or try to hold on to their territory and thus give up on joining NATO. And so this is a very, very, very effective method. And we saw the same thing happen in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. As long as Russia holds Crimea, there is no possible path for Ukraine to join NATO where Ukraine continues to hold any territory, where there is or continues to claim any territory that Russia also claims. When Estonia joined NATO, they were required to settle all these claims, and they did. I don't see that happening in the case of Georgia or Ukraine. So that's the second option, and as I say, that amounts to a total veto, because NATO does not want a shooting war with Russia. They're not going to bring in a country that is having really a frozen conflict or an open conflict with Russia. And so that amounts to a Russian veto. The thing that's important to recognize on this is that since this is a consensus policy and a consensus requirement, all it takes is breaking one member off in order to make sure that that can't happen. And you can incentivize that over a few ways. Right? In the case of Turkey, cheap energy, actually taking what Turkey says about their national security interests seriously, more than, say, the United States does, and working with Turkey on common ground in their own security issues makes a big difference. In the case of Hungary, cheap energy and several other, I would say cheap energy is one of the key things that's been tying the two of them together. And so, and then, you know, in the case of, and then if you're trying to make a country unpalatable for NATO membership, that's going to put a lot more pressure on it. So that's largely how Russia has been containing NATO, and I think that as we've seen with this fast track of Swedish and Finnish NATO membership that seems very much to be on the fast track to nowhere, that this approach has actually been very, very, very successful. Way more successful than I think anybody wants to admit. So that's the major aspect here. And I think that this means largely that as much as certain Eastern European countries might want to think otherwise, it is very much true that NATO isn't a threat to Russia. NATO isn't a threat to Russia very much because NATO is big enough now that getting consensus to bring in more members to continue to encircle or contain Russia just simply isn't going to happen. And even if it starts to happen, Russia has ways of vetoing that rather heavily in ways that the candidate country just simply isn't going to want to risk. So that's what I have there. If you find this content interesting or have thoughts on it, please leave me comments. I'd appreciate a subscription if you feel like following my work. And yeah, that's what I have for you today. I'll be back another day. Have a great day.